Now, we've heard a lot of the European migrant crisis this summer, but is that the right word? And I'm not talking about the word crisis or summer, but migrant.
There was more evidence today of the migrant crisis unfolding across Europe.
Debris of the migrant boat that they were on, the people smugglers' vessel.
They call them the migrants, yet the movement stops here.
There were 280 migrants on board her.
Hundreds and hundreds of migrants and refugees here right on the edge of Greek territory.
The danger of illegal migrants being on board.
So the migrant problem is going to persist.
Well, the Al Jazeera English news channel has decided to more or less drop the word migrant in relation to the Mediterranean arrivals. It thinks it's loaded, it dehumanises the people coming, and has been tarnished, implying they are some kind of nuisance. Al Jazeera English prefers to use the word refugee. Well, I'm joined by the director of news there, Saleh Nejm, and the Telegraph columnist and historian, Tim Stanley. Good evening to you both. Maybe, Saleh, you can just explain your reasoning about this change in the words you're using to describe this group.
Sure, we're using the word migrant. That problem didn't occur just this year. It started a few years ago with people taking boats to the shores of Europe, and they were labeled migrants. This year what happened is the magnitude is totally different. It's a bigger number, it's families with children and women, and apparently the whole problem is changing in nature. So someone came to me from our newsroom asking about whether that term is correct. And the question was, are they migrants and some refugees are among them, or they're refugees and migrants are among them? And I think in the past year, actually the wave changed. There are a lot of refugees fleeing wars, fleeing conflict zones, fearing for their lives, and the whole region around Syria, for example, is saturated. There is 1.8 million refugees in Turkey, 1 million in Jordan, and like 1 million in Lebanon, 200,000 in Iraq, and 500,000 in Egypt. So the tide of refugees changed from the surrounding countries of Syria, as one example, to go to Europe. And that's why we said, okay, shall we make the title immigrants and conceal the real problem, or refugees to use when appropriate, and among them are migrants? Okay. And by that way we can dissect the problem and actually tackle it.
Tim, Saleh's describing something that he thinks really is just journalistically more accurate than migrant. Is that right?
Well, first of all, I have a great deal of sympathy with someone who says that they want to help frame the media debate about the situation in the most balanced and objective way possible. If we're going to do that, then I suggest we turn to the UN's definition of what's going on in the Mediterranean. And the UN's HCR, the refugee agency, says that yes, the majority of people making the crossing are refugees, but it's careful to use the language refugees and migrants because not everyone is. First of all, nothing wrong with being a migrant. In fact, there was an implication by Al Jazeera that it was dehumanizing to use that term. I don't agree with that. It implies free will and free movement to seek labor. There's nothing wrong with that. Second of all, while it is true that the vast majority, probably people making the crossing, are indeed refugees, a lot of them come from countries like Nigeria. That's the 5th largest number of people come from Nigeria, where there is not a war, there is not an oppressive government. Those people are economic migrants. But finally, this attempt to define everyone as a refugee, I think, is an attempt to politically put the onus on Europe to accept everyone without conditions and without due process. I suspect that's the thinking behind it. I'm sympathetic to the moral cause, but I think that deprives Europe of its sovereignty and its right to process every individual case.
Mr. Nejm, does that policy of using the word refugee more frequently, is it simply about journalistic accuracy, or is there an element there of you taking a stand on the issue? And because the blog one of your staff has written about it implies that you don't like the way politicians have talked about migrants, or that they're using the word migrant pejoratively, which of course it doesn't have to be used as a pejorative word. I just wonder whether you're politicising the debate and being non-neutral by suddenly popping up with the word refugee, which is perhaps loaded in a different way.
Not at all. The word migrant is a loaded word, and if you think about the public psyche and understanding of migrant, you can attach to it economic migrant, illegal migrant, whatever of descriptions, while there is an international definition of refugee. Your guest there said that the United Nations itself said the majority are refugees, and that's why we are putting the general title as refugees when appropriate. And this is what we said. We didn't say that we'll call everyone refugee. We said that we are going to use that frequently when appropriate, and there are migrants among them.
Look, I don't understand.
It's not politicizing it. It's going to be more accurate, in fact.
Migrant is not a pejorative word. It's you who's making it pejorative, or some politicians perhaps make it pejorative. But I don't find anything pejorative about the word migrant. There are lots of migrants in the world. And someone who thinks the word migrant is pejorative is probably going to think the word refugee is pejorative, aren't they? They're not going to be happier because you've labelled them refugees as migrants.
I don't think that's correct. Maybe you think so, but I think the majority of people think that it carries a lot of, the word migrant carries a lot of bad connotations around it in the recent years, not in the dictionary definition, while the word refugee has a very clear definition, and actually it reflects a temporary status, because refugees, and that was in a lot of crises, they stay in the host countries until the crisis in their original countries, and then they go back. We have seen that with refugees going back to South Sudan, to Iraq after Iraq war, they went back, to Afghanistan, they went back. So also politically, it implies a very clear definition.
Let me just put this. Let me put this to Tim.
Everyone is a refugee.
Let me put this to Tim. Is there a clear definition, Tim, or is there a fuzzy boundary between migrant and refugee?
That's a very, very good question. It's one reason why we have to keep the definition, the language we use, as broad as possible. Because, for instance, if I'm fleeing a famine, well, I'm a refugee from an economic circumstance. I'm in peril. On the other hand, it could be said that I am fleeing on the basis of a decision made by my own free will. I'm seeking a better economic situation. You know, a very, very good example of where it's difficult to define anyone is Eritrea, which Eritreans now make up the largest number of accepted asylum seeker applications in Britain. But the government has just decided that, in fact, Eritreans are not automatically regarded as refugees, and that, in fact, they can return to the country and their safety will be assured. So the government has said that, more or less has said, look, the people who come from Eritrea are leaving a terrible circumstance. They're leaving a bad government, an awful government, but it is an act of free will, and that makes them a migrant, and that's a different thing.
Complicated business. Thank you both very much.
I've been